There's a phrase that I've heard a lot of folks say over the years, and it particularly pains me. And that phrase is, I'm just not creative. You know, people say that casually, like it's a preference, like they don't like olives or something. But psychologically, this functions more like a verdict than a personality trait. And a lot of folks get themselves into this trap where they think that following instructions means that they are competent. And over time, unfortunately, this identity hardens. Research on self-efficacy shows that people who believe that their abilities are fixed, meaning that their abilities are unchangeable, have a significantly less likelihood of being able to persist when things get hard. So in other words, creativity doesn't disappear because the brain doesn't have the capacity for it, but it disappears because the person has learned not to try. This isn't a personality difference, it's a regulatory shift, because saying I'm not creative very quickly becomes I don't have ideas, which then becomes I don't have much to offer, which then becomes a life organized around compliance and safety over agency. A lot of people in this conversation bring up the right brain, left brain myth, because that's what it is. It's a myth, because it misrepresents neuroscience and gives institutions a way to sort people early and to put them into boxes. Logical kids go over here, creative kids go over here, but creativity, as neuroscience clearly shows, is not a hemispheric trait or even a personality. It's a pattern of network connections across the brain, learned, practiced, and context dependent. Creativity then isn't about making things. It's about whether you believe your world is adjustable. We are here to push back by refusing to let creativity be treated like a luxury trait for confident people. We're here to treat creativity as a biological capacity that either withers or flourishes depending on how much judgment, surveillance, and premature evaluation a brain has been trained to expect. Creativity is not rare, but the permission to use it is. So no, I'm not here to convince you to be more creative. I'm here to name the systems that taught you not to be, and showing you how thoroughly and unfairly that lesson sticks in our brains. So overall in this episode, I'm asking the question, what does the brain need in order to stay open long enough for ideas to arrive? And that question takes us into networks, judgment, play, and risk. But first, we have to understand what's actually happening in the brain when ideas begin to move. Let's get into it. Detox starts now. It's early and I'm already so fired up. You can't tell because I still have my morning voice. Try not to glaze over as I talk about all of these structures of the brain, because while the names aren't super important, the functions of those things that I'm saying the names of are. A lot of these things sound really complicated, but at the end of the day, they're fully not. But I'm also still learning how to remember all the structures of the brain and what they do. So this is going to be practice for all of us. Okay, great. Chapter 1, the default mode network and idea fluency. For a really long time, neuroscience treated creativity like a side effect instead of a skill that you could foster. So early brain imaging studies were often focused on task completion. Can you get the right answer to this math equation? Can you fit the circle block into the circle hole? And anything that looked creative got dismissed as cognitive noise. So things like daydreaming, wandering, zoning out, all of the things teachers taught us were a waste of time in classrooms, all of those things were shut down. But then, at the turn of the 21st century, researchers started noticing something that was, to everyone who came before them, deeply inconvenient. So when people were not doing a task, they were resting, reflecting, drifting, the brain didn't go quiet. and shut down. It lit up in a very specific and repeatable pattern. And this was formally identified in 2001, showing that a consistent network of brain regions become more active during rest than when engaged in externally oriented tasks. And they called it the default mode network, or DMN for short. And this is the brain's default setting when the brain is allowed to idle. And the default mode network is involved in a lot of different functions like autobiographical memory, emotional processing, social cognition, future simulation, narrative construction, and meaning making. So, in other words, the default mode network is where the brain connects dots over time, space, emotion, identity, and experience. And all of these things that I just mentioned, emotion, memory, relationships, all of those things are needed for creativity. So there is a direct connection between the default mode network and your biological ability to engage in creative tasks. Are you still with me? I'm about to say brain things now, okay? The default mode network is the engine of idea generation, and it includes the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus, and parts of the hippocampus. But before we dig deeper into the default mode network, we need to talk about the other networks that are possibly overriding the default, okay? So the first one is the executive control network. So this is anchored in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the posterior parietal cortex, which helps evaluate, refine, and implement ideas. And then we also have the salience network, which includes the anterior insula and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. The ACC, we're going to talk about her later, the ACC. She's my favorite, real tiny, right? And doesn't matter. And the salience network is not me getting the most excited for the anterior cingulate cortex. I love her. We all need her. I'm training mine to be better. I'm so ahead of myself. And the salience network is responsible for toggling between the default mode network and the executive control network. So the default mode network dreams, the executive control network judges, and the salience network decides when to toggle between the two. And creativity happens best when all three networks interact flexibly, but not when one of them completely takes over. So there is another network, and it's the closest to the opposite of the default mode network, and it's called the dorsal attention network. This network activates when the brain is focused on structured, goal-directed tasks, answering questions, completing worksheets, what have you. And when this one dominates without a default mode network engagement, idea generation collapses, and students are left with this idea of a false dichotomy of right or wrong, black or white, compliance mode, zero divergence. Boring. So this is why it's not confusing that a lot of people say I'm not creative, because they spent years in classrooms that suppressed their internal thought, they rewarded conformity, and they minimized downtime, and the default mode network isn't given the bandwidth to operate, because the networks that enable self-generated thought and creativity literally get starved in 21st century classrooms. Over time, this affects your self-efficacy, which is your idea of yourself and how good you are at things. So this all works in the creation of the adults who say, I'm not creative. They're hesitant to experiment or to risk or just to imagine things. The socioeconomic factors directly play into this, because environments that emphasize, high stakes testing, external evaluation, all of these things disproportionately suppress default mode network activity, especially in under-resourced schools. But before we get depressed, classrooms can be built in such a way to directly support default mode network and creativity. Teachers don't need to make their students more creative. They need to create the conditions that allow the default mode network activity by providing students with a lot of things that we're going to get into later. We're not creating anything. We're not bringing in anything new. You are just protecting the natural biological processes that support creativity. It's not what are we adding, it's what are we protecting. Ultimately, creativity is about network flexibility and not innate talent. Classrooms that flatten or suppress default mode network are inherently limiting possibilities in their classrooms. The students that get labeled not creative are often the ones whose brains are biologically prevented from exploring because their environments have trained them to inhibit the very network that generates ideas. And we will label this idea generation as idea fluency, which is the ability to create many ideas, and it correlates strongly with the default mode network activation. Okay, here is the most important sentence that I'm going to say in this entire episode. So, lean in with me so you're prepared to hear it clearly. Here we go. Creativity requires time spent in a cognitive state that looks unproductive from the outside. Hell, I'm going to say it again. Creativity requires time spent in a cognitive state that looks unproductive from the outside. So we're going to explore this more by talking about fMRIs, and they show that highly creative individuals don't simply have more ideas. Their brains are better at letting the default mode network roam without immediately shutting it down with judgment or evaluation. Okay, so indulge me here while I briefly nerd out about brain scans, okay? So we have an MRI. You've probably heard that before. Magnetic resonance imaging. So this is the big metal tube that whirls around you and, takes a picture of your brain or your broken leg or whatever it is. And it uses strong magnetic fields to map out the tissue that is put inside. So if you scan a brain, you can see gray matter, white matter, lesions, tumors, and anything structural, okay? So it doesn't measure the activity of the brain, it measures the structure. And that's where an fMRI scan comes in. So the F just stands for functional MRI. And it is so cool because it measures brain activity over time. And it does that by monitoring the blood flow that's in the brain. Because when an area in the brain gets more active, there's more oxygenated blood that flow to that spot. And the fMRI picks up these small changes in the oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. Okay. And this is known as the bold signal, which you don't need to know. But bold signal sounded fun. Blood oxygen level dependent. So an MRI is like looking at a still image of a city skyline. And an fMRI is actually standing there in real time and the sun goes down and you can watch all of the lights turn on and you can see where there's people doing things and you can see where there's no action and you can be there in the moment and actually assess activity versus just looking at the structure. So what this means for our conversation is that somebody could have a perfectly healthy looking brain, but have network level disruptions. You could have circuits that aren't communicating properly. You could have connectivity that was off, or regions that don't activate when they should. And before fMRIs, these functional issues were essentially invisible. People could struggle with attention, memory, emotional regulation, creativity, the whole bit. And yet the medical community would say, your brain's fine. Your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, I don't even think that's a thing. Your anterior cingulate cortex, it's there. I see it. You have one. You're fine. Why are you getting angry all the time? Go home. So a lot of people's experiences and difficulties were just fully invalidated because they weren't reflected in the visible structure of the brain with an MRI scan. And this is a very important parallel when it comes to education because a student may appear fine by the surface measures like grades, compliance, neat printing, but the underlying cognitive and emotional networks might be underactivated, misaligned, or under threat. So while it is important to notice the structure, we also need to pay attention to the function and create space for those functions to grow and operate in our classrooms. So when it comes to research on creativity, fMRIs are essential because we want to see how the default mode network, executive control network, and the salience network, we want to see how all of these networks are activating while people are doing things and not just the structures that these networks use in order to operate. I really love fMRI scans, and it's a really big part of what got me interested in neuroscience in the first place. Like watching brains light up while people are doing tasks or sleeping or being surprised or being told a joke. I love that. And watching brain scans on YouTube in real time drew me in immediately. I was hooked. It's great. And a big part of that research is somebody by the name of Dr. Daniel Amen. Full disclosure, he came to my attention because he was platformed by Dr. Phil, so you do kind of have to watch for some right-wing dog whistles. But I haven't heard any yet from Dr. Daniel Amen, so, we should be fine there. But I won't be having another Oprah-level oops of, I accidentally platformed pseudoscience. Never again. Anyway, moving on. So now we're going to zoom in on schools and talk about how they are particularly hostile towards the default mode network. So in any given classroom, you have pretty consistent task switching, you have relentless evaluation, you have external attention demands, and you have time pressure. And these conditions preferentially activate networks like the executive control network. So while the executive control network is essential, we need it for a lot of things, but when it dominates constantly, our capability for idea fluency just collapses. So in order to support the default mode network, we have to create the conditions where it is allowed to surface without immediate punishment. So moments of productive weirdness, like off-script questions, strange analogies, unexpected emotional responses, all of these are signs that the default mode network is active and integrating material in personal, meaningful ways. And Britzman calls this difficult knowledge, learning that resists neat packaging because it forces the learner to confront uncertainty, identity, or emotion. And the default mode network thrives in exactly these types of moments. And the key takeaway here is that creativity isn't rare, idea fluency isn't genetic, and the default mode network is not a luxury. It's a biological system that schools systemically starve. Come on, alliteration. And once you know that, calling a kid not creative stops sounding like an observation and starts functioning more like a diagnosis of a problem that we ourselves caused. God, that's depressing. But we're done with this chapter now. Don't worry. It's gonna, yeah, it gets better. Chapter 2, generating without judging. So creativity is about letting ideas exist without an immediate internal censor. And idea generation collapses when judgment kicks in too early. This is why brainstorming exercises in a classroom so often fail. Students self-censor before they even finish thinking, because their executive control network dominates, inhibiting novelty, flagging deviation, and labeling wrong ideas as dangerous before people can even explore them. When the executive control network overpowers the default mode network, the flow of ideas is completely stopped. But when the default mode network can run freely, and when the executive control network just gently nudges for refinement, something remarkable happens. Idea fluency, which is the ability to generate multiple ideas at once rapidly without freezing in self-critique. And this is supported by studies that involve fMRIs and EEGs, which show that highly creative individuals display a unique pattern of co-activation. Default mode network for ideation and executive control network engagement delayed until evaluation, and the salient network dynamically toggling between the two, right? We need the executive control network because at the end of all the creativity, we need somebody to be able to look at it and be a little bit critical. But you cannot be critical throughout the ideation process. There are no bad ideas. And our brains do not innately engage in this kind of evaluation of our own work. It's either trained or it's suppressed over time. And kids are a great place to start because they are naturally less self-critical because their networks are more permissive. So by the time most adults reach classrooms or workplaces, years of grading, public shaming, and socialization have all trained them to shut down the default mode network at the hint of an error. So let's take an example of a science classroom. Imagine a project where students are designing a fictional ecosystem. And one of the students says, "What if all the trees in my ecosystem screamed when it rained?" In this very moment, the executive control network in the brain of that student is about to flag this idea as nonsense. But if the teacher says nothing, or better yet, leans in and goes, "So, tell me more about your screaming trees," the salience network recognizes that this idea might be worth spending time on, and the default mode network remains active, and the student begins exploring. So this very small moment of non-judgment is exactly where idea fluency spikes. And even really small adjustments in classrooms can amplify this effect. So studies on idea generation interventions show that removing evaluation pressure and explicitly framing activities as exploration first, judgment later, increases the quality and originality of ideas. So setting out a piece of your day where there are no wrong answer sessions or improvisation moments, all of these exercises physically reduce executive control network dominance, letting the default mode network patterns propagate and new connections will start to form. Another important layer of this conversation is emotion, because research indicates that positive affect broadens the range of ideas generated, particularly because it reduces function in the amygdala, which is usually associated with threat responses, and those threat responses would otherwise suppress the default mode network and novelty seeking, which isn't what we want. So this means that things like laughing, curiosity, or even mild surprise and frustration makes students' brains more willing to tolerate half-baked ideas like the screaming trees. Our work as educators here is to actively undo all of this cognitive suppression imposed by social and institutional stressors. Down with capitalism! Finally, fluency is self-reinforcing. Every time a student experiences a judgment-free generation, the brain starts to recognize these patterns as safe. The prefrontal cortex calibrates and says, exploration is okay, thinking sideways is okay, being weird is safe. And over time, what feels uncomfortable at first becomes ordinary, because classrooms that consistently allow judgment-free ideation are producing more ideas, and they're retraining their neural circuitry for lifelong creative confidence. Lifelong creative confidence. To finish up this chapter, I'm going to say, generation without judgment is not accidental. It is a learned neural state. And we have the power to create conditions for it by protecting the default mode network, regulating the executive control network, and leveraging the salience network, and signaling safety through relationships and emotional context. Fluency is neural flexibility nurtured over time in spaces where weirdness is allowed to breathe. Boom. Okay, chapter 3. Why does play feel so risky? I want you to know that this chapter is a lot shorter than the other ones in this episode because I do have other episodes that explicitly go over this idea of play in depth. You can watch it right here. But I thought it was important to quickly recap this because it's a very prominent part of the conversation we're having here about creativity. So for many people, play feels risky and dangerous because the brain doesn't naturally separate serious learning from risk. When we play, our prefrontal cortex has to tolerate uncertainty, ambiguity, and at least some deviation from the rules. So the same executive control network that judges creativity and suppresses the default mode network, it lights up like a security guard, scanning for violations, errors, or threats. And once you add in social evaluation, like peers watching, teachers observing, and suddenly play triggers your amygdala, and you're in a full threat response. This is exactly why so many classrooms punish play, because it looks chaotic, it sounds inefficient, and it definitely feels off task, and students are trained to suppress the very behaviors that make creative thinking or deep engagement possible. And neuroscience shows us that playful engagement activates the default mode network for idea generation, the executive control network for strategic refinement, and the salience network to determine what is worth attending to, but only if the environment signals safety. So all of these things that I've mentioned now a bunch of times about those three networks, right? The creative one, the critical one, and the toggle, they all work perfectly together as a team, but only if we feel safe. And this is important here because play requires trust. Trust that your mistakes won't be shamed. Trust that deviation won't be punished. And trust that being a little weirdo is just fine. And this is the relational safety component of weird pedagogy. When students feel this sense of safety, the brain shifts from threat mode to exploratory mode. Cortisol decreases, oxytocin rises, and dopamine flags novelty as rewarding. And a lot of adults struggle with play as well. Ask a professional team of corporate whoever's to play during a brainstorm session and you'll see the hesitation, the censorship, and the excessive structure that comes out. It's not incompetence. It's the brain's stress response in action. Play feels unsafe when networks governing evaluation and social monitoring dominate. And when teachers create more opportunities for guided and low-stakes play, they're literally rewiring students' brains to allow exploration, connection, and creative idea fluency. So the takeaway here is that play is risky only when the environments signal danger. And you can actively construct the social, emotional, and cognitive conditions to make play feel safe. And that's how we're going to finish up this episode, is we're going to talk about how to construct this very space. Which leads me into the conclusion: creativity as a learnable skill. How do we do it? How do we get there? So we all have a capacity for creativity. And like any capacity, it can be supported or suppressed depending on the environment. And this claim is supported by decades of research on the neural systems involved in idea generation and how they develop through experience, context, and practice. First, creativity depends on cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to shift between ideas and perspectives rather than sticking to the first answer that seems more safe. Play, in its many forms, is one of the most powerful ways that humans develop this flexibility. So when children engage in unstructured play, their brain repeatedly toggles between exploration and rule testing, generating new strategies and kicking out the old ones. So while it looks like children may just be playing and being weird, they're training their neurocognition. Play also supports executive functioning skills like working memory, task switching, and cognitive control, and all of these are central to adapting and refining ideas without shutting the creative process down too early. Students learn rules by breaking them, testing them, and rewiring their expectations, and that is the core neurological work of creative brains. And you can support these things with activities like music and rhythm because they activate the brain's anticipation circuits, strengthening prediction and surprise mechanisms that overlap heavily with creative thought. This is why improvisational dancers, musicians, and storytellers generate ideas fluidly, not because they're born special, but because their nervous system has practiced patterns of anticipation and adaptive responses. Even the motivation to explore uncertainty, which is the thing that we call curiosity, has its own neural system, distinct from simple reward chasing. It pushes us towards novelty even when there's no obvious payoff, and that explains why a lot of creative breakthroughs happen not when we are playing to win, but when we are genuinely drawn into the unknown. Thank you so much for watching this episode and getting to the very end. You can listen to these episodes on Spotify, but if you like watching the video, I'm glad to have you here too. Let me know what you think in the comments down there, and subscribe to this channel if you want to catch the episodes that are coming. There's a lot more that are coming, but for now, I'm going to leave you with this. Please do not treat creativity like a bonus. Creativity is a biological capacity that thrives under the conditions of relational safety, unstructured exploration, and emotional engagement. When people experience judgment-free idea generation, not only do their brains produce more ideas, but they begin to trust their own creative process. And that trust rewires neural pathways, supporting executive control without prematurely collapsing idea fluency. Now go out there today and do something so weird and creative that everybody around you is gonna think you're a wacko, and that's exactly the point. Thanks again for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.